Welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization Show, the home of Googlization Nation, where we talk with HR and business thought leaders about the crazy shift going on all around us and explore the disruptive convergence of technology, business, and people. Here are your hosts, Ira Wolfe and Jason Cochran.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization Show. And this is a really special episode. We want to also thank you for being part of Googlization Nation. I'm Ira Wolfe.
And I'm Jason Cochran. If you think this is just another podcast, think again. We're the voice of the most important, crucial conversations that are confronting business leaders and people today. Our goal is to bring you ways to reimagine tomorrow and explore the impact and convergence of business, technology, and people.
Jason, we can certainly check off all those boxes today as we tackle one of the most hotly debated workplace topics or workforce topics in, that's going on, remote work. To help you understand and make sense of what's going on, we've brought together three of our favorite workplace thought leaders, Kate Lister, Jeff Abbott, and Gad Levanon.
I can't wait, Ira. And once again, this episode of Geeks, Geezers, Googlization is sponsored by our partners at Why Institute, your personal and professional GPS for a meaningful life and purpose-filled career. You'll hear more about the Why operating system and Why Institute later on in the show.
We're going to forego our usual Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization traditions, our riff between Jason and myself, and including the Perfect Labor Storm segment. We'll get back to that in a future episode. But in order to get right to our panel of experts, we are excited to welcome today Kate Lister. Kate is the president of Global Workforce Analytics and an internationally recognized authority on remote work. Jeff Abbott, who is the CEO of Avanti Incorporated, a leading cybersecurity company and an expert on the impact of everywhere work on IT security and the digital employee experience. And Gad Levanon, who's the chief economist at Burning Glass Institute, a renowned expert on labor markets and workforce trends. So without further ado, we're going to bring everybody back onto the GGG stage. So welcome, Kate. Welcome, Gad. And welcome, Jeff.
Thank you.
Good. Well, obviously, there's a lot of people that signed up for this. So there's a lot of people that are really, really interested. Every single day, we seem to have another, I won't say a crisis, but another CEO seems to say, hey, everybody's coming back into the workplace. And so forth. That hasn't worked out. So we're going to get your opinions on that. But let's start with a brief intro from each of you. I've already identified what your company is, but let's talk a little bit about what, I guess what surprised you most in the last 2 to 3 years with the, how employers and employees have responded to, I guess, the opportunity to work remotely. So Kate, let's start with you.
I guess the biggest thing initially was how well it went. I would typically spend 6 months to a year working with a client to get them ready for, any level of remote work. And that overnight it worked, but not quite. So I'm still employed. And then sort of 3 years in, just how much leaders are still in denial that it's going to go back to the old way. And for reasons that are not supported or actually refuted by research and science.
Hey, Jeff, I'm going to jump to you because I forgot to mention Avanti, and Jeff, you are now part of our GGG Unleashed series, and your first one just came out. And that's exactly what you talked about, is we're not going back to normal. So what a good segue. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, and I could not agree more with Kate. She stole the first thought that came to my head, which is it went extraordinarily well. In fact, I commented at one point in late 2020 that this is probably the most unified human cooperation in recorded history. The entire world was just unified and behaved pretty well in terms of not only getting vaccinated, but moving them to the remote workforce during the pandemic. I also agree with Kate that it is baffling to me that my colleagues in the IT industry even, have tried a forced march in some cases and really paid a dear price for it in terms of talent voting with their feet and moving on. And let's face it, the last year and a half has shown us that the war on talent is on, and choice in terms of where we work from and how we do our work is absolutely near the top of the list in terms of how people are ranking their opportunities. And we're all having to adjust. And some, I think, are leaning into that choice that employees and the workforce wants, and others, as Kate said, are in denial. And it's amazing to me, but I'll personally capitalize on it as people try to kind of screw in an old school mentality into the contemporary workforce. It's not going to work.
Hey, Gad, you are our labor market expert. You slice and dice the data in ways that are unimaginable. So what surprised you, and what are some of the trends that you've seen now over the last few weeks or few months with some of the newer data that's kind of surprised you or struck you as super interesting?
Well, I think so. The micro change is that more workers in a company are working from home, but that change has led to other related changes. So, for example, people are quitting their jobs much more than they used to. And I think that part of it is because they have more options than they used to. They are not constrained to the employers in their own metro area. They can get a job in other places. The donut effect, the fact that people stopped commuting to city centers, shifted a lot of the food services and shopping and other industries to where people live instead of in city centers. So that's another big trend. So there are some kind of major changes that would make it very difficult to return to the old ways. People are moving. Companies are hiring in outside the metro areas, so it will be very almost irreversible. But I would say that we are still at a very early part of the game. I think how all of this plays out will take years to figure out, and I think eventually it will come down to, within an industry. Some companies will have a very flexible model of remote work, some will have less, and who succeeds more in the market, that will determine the kind of long-run remote work policy. So I think we had a big change. It was better than expected. It will be hard to reverse, but it's not the end of the game yet, I think.
I just wanted to also let all our listeners know, whether you're listening or watching, if you have a comment, if you have a question, please post them in your comments, in the comment sections. We will get most of them. If you have a question, we'll try to address that. And we have an opportunity with three of our favorite thought leaders. We can pick their brains while they're here. Kate, Gad brought up, certainly about not only the preferences, but the a little bit on the office space and people coming back. But you had a really, really interesting source. I don't know if this was your data or somebody else's, or a comment maybe 2-3 months back in the newsletter, and I constantly cite it. The cost to work from home, the cost of commuting, or the cost to work from home is twice as much to go back to the office than to commute as it is to stay at home. And especially, with the concerns about inflation, the concerns, cost of gas, cost of everything has gone up. That seems to be one aspect that, employers who are bringing people back is just overlooking. But can you share a little bit more about that data and what you've seen since then?
Yeah. It kind of surprises me before the pandemic, even during, how many the percentage of people that said that they would quit if they weren't allowed to continue the kind of flexibility. It's been running typically in the 35 to 40%. And yet, now that they're at home, they're wanting their employer to pay their heating and their food and their coffee and all of that. I think they have to remember how much they're saving, but it's not how much that really counts. I mean, that's kind of like a kind of a far back secondary reason that they're really enjoying home. It's the time that they save. And a typical employee loses 11 days in playing in traffic, and that's just for half-time remote work. It's a lifestyle thing. The cost is going to become more important, and I think even more so to the employer. The recession is going to shine a light on those big empty buildings, and the shareholders are going to be saying, "Okay, what are we going to do about this?" Oddly, I mean, who would have thought the trigger may be when their leases are coming due. So during the pandemic, only about 30% of leases came due. And even that, early on, nobody knew what was going on. We all thought we were going back in 3 months. And so we're going to see play out, as Gad said, over the next 5 to 7 years, what the remainder of those leases, as they come up, the employers are going to say, okay, now we have to make a decision.
Kate, let's go down that rabbit hole a little bit further and then I want Gad and Jeff to chime in too on this. Kate, you just yesterday, I believe it was, posted something about a report that came out from Cushman and Wakefield on office space in the future. And I was floored by the findings. 1.1 billion square feet of office space by 2030 is expected to be vacant. I guess my question for you is, what do we do with that vacant space? Are there ways to reimagine it to make it part of total rewards programs for employees where you convert it into gyms, coffee shops? What do we do to prepare for this?
Well, we kind of got ourselves into a pickle by allowing the downtown areas to be so singular focused on office. If it was office, retail, cultural, home, living, the crisis wouldn't have hit them so hard. And I think that's where it's going to go. It's going to go back to, or it's going to go to a kind of a live, work, play environment. And there are some companies that are specializing in the conversion of office to residential, but it's not easy. It's particularly not easy in some of the more modern buildings, but that's kind of good because there's a flight out of the grade B and C level buildings and into the A level buildings. So those are the ones that are going to be empty. But we have to remember they were pretty vacant before the pandemic. Occupancy studies around the world over and over and over again showed that offices were only 40 to 50% occupied during the day. So people had already left the building, even before the pandemic. And so if you add now that only about 45 to 50% are back at any frequency, that means there's only about 25% of people there. I mean, it's a ghost town. And that's one of the things that employers are having trouble with. How do we if we get people to come in to sit here and be on Zoom calls, they're not going to want to come in.
And so if Elvis has left the building, Jeff, I'm going to send it over to you. If Elvis has left the building as a CEO of a company, are these conversations happening at Avanti where you're starting to try and put some plans in place and wrestle with this concept of what you're going to do with your physical footprint?
Yeah, 100%, Jason. And in fact, we started this analysis in parallel to monitoring employee traffic in our offices about 6 months ago. So starting last May, at Avanti, we held a series of events called Homecoming, right? And it was more or less little parties in every one of our offices to try and draw traffic back to the offices. We made it voluntary. We allowed them to do themes. There was a disco theme and a prom theme, believe it or not. I mean, they had fun with it, right? Of course, because the company paid for some catering and some bar tabs and so on. But anyway, my expectation was that after that, we'd start to see a cycle of increasing traffic in the offices. Didn't happen. We're still 7 to 8% occupied in our 30 office locations around the world. And that's consistent around the world. So I talked to our facilities, my head of facilities, and said, let's line out all the leases. To Kate's point, let's look at the timing and start planning. We have a fiduciary responsibility on this, and it doesn't make sense to maintain this cost. That person backed me up a little bit and said, well, it's summertime. Let's wait and see in the fall when everybody goes back to school and so on. Did not change, went down even further. So we're in the process now of phase 1 of phasing out some space, including our headquarters, which is 5 full floors for about 350 employees in Salt Lake City, Utah. We're going down to 1.5 floors. Now, interestingly, Kate, a side product of that move is employees are like, well, wait a minute, is the company in trouble? No, the company's not in trouble. I'm telling you, I've told you a year ago, we have to monitor, traffic and make a responsible financial move to take this cost out. So it's funny, people are definitely settling in to the everywhere workplace, but yet when you start to, make moves, to your question, Jason, on moving, lowering cost in kind, they get nervous. So it's an interesting dynamic you have to manage to. In fact, I'll be headed out to Salt Lake in about a month to do a town hall meeting with those employees to kind of make sure they understand everything's fine, but we're going to start saving money. It's $2 million a year, right? It's real money.
Jeff, are you doing anything to reconfigure the offices to accommodate, more of the work that's going to be done there?
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. So the other thing is we have a gym in the lobby of that building that was exclusively for the company, and we're now considering opening it up to the other tenants in the building, and perhaps because that was just a cost we were bearing. Let's now perhaps create some $5 a month memberships for the other tenants or something like that, because it's being unused. This beautiful, beautiful space is being unused. But to your point, the main floor we are completely reconfiguring. There will only be about maybe 15-20% will be dedicated space to the teams that need it, that are coming in regularly. And again, we're measuring statistically who's coming in. But the rest of the space is going to a very open concept, very hotel oriented. And to the point earlier about people wanting some cost offset from working from home, as we're evaluating leasing or subleasing space and reducing our footprint, we're allowing employees to come in and kind of grab whatever they want in terms of monitors and the monitor arm bars and so on, so that they can trick out their own home offices with the best gear and equipment. And that's gone really well. When they heard that opportunity, they were in there fast, right? So there are measures we're taking to kind of lean into the employees as we make these changes in real estate.
And Gad, to you, with this trend, with the physical footprint and office space, any research as well that's coming out from Burning Glass Institute on what this is looking like for the future?
Well, we didn't write on it yet, but there has been a lot of written on it. And in some sense, the invisible hand of the market is going to take care of a lot of it. If real estate cost in city centers in large metro areas, if they're empty, then their prices will go down. And then, some offices of like, let's say, secondary companies who, let's say in the New York area, they were headquartered in New Jersey or in upstate New York. Now they can afford to move into New York City. So we'll see some of that. We'll perhaps see some conversion from office buildings to residential, although it's easier said than done. But I will probably see, we're already seeing some of that. So I think, the prices, they will adjust to the new demand and supply, and the market will react that way.
One of the other things I was reading the other day is that some companies have problems because they're going to lose big tax credits if they move or if they reduce their city workforce. So, if they were given tax credits to build a headquarters in a certain area, they get paid those after the fact, like after 3 years. And the conditions typically are that they have to have X percentage of their employees working in those spaces. So JP Morgan, for example, stands to lose a great deal of tax breaks if they can't get their people to come back in.
That's interesting because over the last week there was a whole lot of headlines, as Amazon announced that they're going to require people to come back, and then the whole business community applauded because now their businesses will thrive again. But that also means that the people actually have to come back. And they come back on a regular basis, and they're coming back on a 5-day-a-week basis, and they're going to eat out lunch, which goes back to what I brought up to you before, Kate, is that when you account for the cost of commuting, cost to get there, whether it's public transportation or private, and then the cost for lunch and going out or doing whatever you do, that was substantially more than staying at home. Obviously, people still need to eat and to do things, but with the cost of gas, basically going up quite a bit in the past, and public transportation costs going up, and just the cost of going out to eat or grabbing a sandwich or grabbing a soda. Sodas used to be 50 cents or $1. Now they're $3. So there's so many dynamics going on. Kind of a theme behind all this, as you were talking, and Jeff, you're talking. Your headquarters is in Salt Lake City. We hear about all these hubs, and we're online, and we're probably all on high speed bandwidth today, or broadband. But there's a lot of areas of the country that still don't have access to that. There's a lot of people who don't have access to effectively work remotely. So Gad, you had and then I want to get the comments from Kate and Jeff on this. But Gad, you had a really interesting post last week or 2 weeks ago about the geography of where people are moving. And some of it was related to red and blue states, but some of it was related to the industries that are there. But again, another factor was the availability of bandwidth, because some of the people are commenting is that, hey, we live 50 miles outside in a rural area, and they're getting their internet off of a dish antenna. So it's struggling. So Gad, if you can comment on that, and then I'd love to hear Kate and Jeff's responses to it.
Yeah, there is. In the grand story of the shift to remote work, there is a lot of variability by location. So some states and metro area have very high shares of remote work, and some have much lower. And it's like not entirely clear what's driving this. I think one thing for sure is what happened during the pandemic. The areas that were more shut down, their people got used to working from home for like a year and a half when everyone was doing this. Whereas there are some areas that maybe people were home for 2 months and then they were straight back at the office. So they didn't create this new habit of working from home. So I think some of it will remain permanent, those gaps. There's of course like the industry and occupational mix. Not every job lends itself to remote work, but I think there's very interesting variability across states and metro areas, and some of it I think will be permanent.
And Kate, I see you nodding there, but aren't we focused? I mean, you have these numbers. It's about 40% of jobs that can be remote.
It's over 60. I mean, if you look at the percentage of people that did it during the pandemic, the number's over 60%. And right. Of course, as Gad says, that it's very different across geography, across industries, but in total, that's what it comes to.
But we're talking about, and again, I think it's maybe 40% of the jobs, but there may be a lot of people in those particular jobs. But there's certain jobs that people have to show up for work. Either because we don't have the technology or we won't have the technology for a while. I mean, healthcare, some manufacturing, we still have to, construction workers, the trades. I mean, they're not sending robots.
Teachers.
Yeah.
The top 2 occupations in the country: teachers, truck drivers.
Truck drivers, we may be
looking at remote there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not yet.
Not yet. Exactly. Not yet. And it's important for companies that have like a mixed worker profile. So, some people are in office, some people are in the field. That there's something in it for everyone. because we can't create this divide of the haves and the have-nots. And were we talking to a company prior to the pandemic, it wouldn't just be about remote work. It would have been about compressed work week, 4-day work week, part-time, sabbaticals, staggered end times, staggered start times, staggered break times, something, people just want some control over their day. In fact, they want control over the time that they work even more than they want control over where they work. And oddly, I'm finding employers are more resistant to that, to allowing go outside of that 9 to 5. Some companies have moved to between 10 and 2, let's all be available, or whatever the collective time zones dictate. And then, your flexibility, so you can do the rest of your life in those other times along with work. I think that's going to win out.
And Kate, one of the solutions that's being posited right now to help with that flexibility with the time seems to be the 4-day work week, 32-hour work week.
Yeah.
In fact, in the research that you did with Owl Labs, along with your organization, Global Workplace Analytics, if I remember right, it was up to around 90% of employees indicated an interest in exploring the ability to do the 4-day, 32-hour work week. Is that gaining steam? Do you see that as a plausible way of providing more of that flexibility that's desired here in the U.S.?
Yeah, there was a big pilot in the UK, and I forget how many companies were involved. I don't know, Gad, do you? I think it was maybe, I'm not even going to say, but a number of companies, including big companies and including companies in the US, did a 6-month trial for this, and none of them stopped it after the 6-month trial, at least as an option. Not everybody did it, but as least, because there are difficulties with that too. Can you get childcare, 4 days a week? Is it going to be the same day a week? There's a lot of sense to it in terms of sustainability. If you can literally shut down that building on one of the days a week, and if you can provide some predictability to food services and restaurants and all of the surrounding retail, I think that would improve things. So yeah, there's not a one size fits all. It should be, I think, a suite of flexibility and a whole mindset of flexibility.
I think the interesting phenomenon we haven't all thought through yet, and I'm, as a kind of a practitioner of the everywhere workplace, I'm dealing with this now, is the required change in leadership. Mm-hmm. You're now having to manage not only your direct reports, but your extended teams entirely remotely. You may hire and never meet the people you work with, right? So the mentality shift and the tools with which we use to engage and to monitor productivity and to keep inspiration and energy high, it's a whole other kind of work stream or challenge alongside the shift that practitioners like myself, we're all working through, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't have answers yet. We're all kind of resetting our leadership chops to this everywhere environment.
Martha Johnson was the head of the USGSA when they were transforming their headquarters building in downtown Washington to activity-based working, and nobody was going to have an assigned desk, and there was going to be a lot of remote work, and it was a very successful pilot program. And she said later in the, after there was some experience with it, is that telework, the word they use, telework doesn't create management problems, it reveals them. And so, I love that, the pandemic didn't create these problems. It revealed that we weren't managing people by results, that we weren't equipping managers to manage. We were just promoting somebody from a position because they'd been there for a while and now they were a manager, but they really didn't have the skills to do that. We were babysitting, essentially, by heads in, butts in seats, heads in seats mentality. We didn't know where our people were working, really. Where were those other 50% of people that weren't in the building? Just on and on and on. We hadn't digitized so many things that the pandemic brought light to.
Interestingly, too, and I've talked to Ira and Jason about this. This contemporary workforce is now measuring culture higher than ever before, right? And purpose in the work higher than ever before. This is not a workforce that is entirely tied to paychecks and promotions, right? You get a taste for, with the remote work, the flexibility that you have in your own personal life and create more balance. And then you start thinking, I really want to make sure I'm connected to this organization, right? You get that much more naturally, kind of, you know, in the office environment. You can pick up the vibe, right? But when you are remote, that's difficult. So the evaluation that the individual worker is now kind of placing on the company they work for is like never before. We've done some research on it, and they're, the stack rank is culture is very high, pay and vacation time, et cetera, is starting to drop, right? Because the flexibility they now have as remote workers.
And the government is highly interested in this too, right? I mean, just this last October, the Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Surgeon General issued their framework for mental health in the workplace because of how concerning it is and how many people aren't finding mattering or purpose in their work, and that it's actually having a detrimental impact on their overall health and well-being. Gad, I'll kick it off with you this time as we kind of explore this side of wellness in the workplace and culture. What are some of the scary things, maybe we'll start off with, that you're seeing in some of the labor data when it comes to how employees are feeling about their employers right now, even if they might be working remotely?
Yeah, so there has been, I mean, during the pandemic, employers were actually, or during, I would say, the beginning of the pandemic, employers were relatively supportive. I mean, it was kind of like a feeling of we're all in it together. And job satisfaction rates were actually quite high. But after that, I think when things come to back to normal, the job satisfaction goes back to normal. And I think on top of that, there is, especially among young workers, there is a real mental health crisis right now. The share, for example, of people between the ages of 19 or 18 to 21 that report weekly depression episodes is twice as high as it was a decade ago, and higher than any other age group. A decade ago, it was the lowest of any age group. So I think, and that partly because of the pandemic, partly because of the young generation is addicted to social media. There are a lot of issues related to that, but there's definitely a deterioration in well-being.
There was an interesting Gallup survey that came out talking about remote work, and they looked at on-site workers of what their preferences were and what the impact of burnout and stress and thriving was. And there was a direct correlation or an inverse correlation between the on-site workers. There was a small percentage that wanted to be on site and they preferred it that way, and their mental health and their attitudes, and they felt they were thriving. And then as they moved toward hybrid, the lines shifted. So there was less satisfaction, there was less engagement, there was less thriving, more stress and more burnout for those on-site workers who wanted to be at least remote. And then when you looked at being fully remote, it went completely off the rails, because the people who were on site who wanted to work remote, there was only a 17% engagement level at work, and there was a 65% burnout rate going to the office. They were still working. They just preferred to have either more flexibility or have that option to work remote or work hybrid. And it seems like an easy solution, but from some of the leaders, they seem to be, forcing it back, and they're getting, pats on the back from the local businesses, which I always having lived in small communities and understand the importance of businesses, that's a good thing. But I don't know how we're putting the toothpaste back in this tube, over there. We've had a couple really, really good questions. This was one I hadn't thought of before, so I want to address it. It comes from Greg. Thanks very much for that. I'll just read it here. It's pretty long. And he starts off, I just got off a call with Bob Johansson. I don't know if you're from, some of you may be familiar with him, but he started and founder of the Institute for the Future. I've quoted him all over my books over years, as I do you, Kate. I think I found a white paper, Kate, that you published or an article on telecommuting, like 25 years ago.
Yep.
Yeah. So he's basically agrees with everything we're doing, but he said he believes there's a major historical transformation occurring right now. And he wanted to know, he talked about generational differences when it comes to the digitization through the flexible work environment. Do you see a generation gap shrinking or growing through this transition? So the fact is that we can work remote. I'm a way older baby boomer. We've got different generations represented even on this panel. Do we see the ability to work remotely closing a generation gap, or do we see it, ripping it apart?
By the numbers, interestingly, boomers are the highest, have the highest desire for being in office full time, and the hybrid, or I'm sorry, not the hybrid, millennials have the highest desire to be hybrid, and Generation X was having the hardest time during the pandemic and needed that office time. And if you think about it, I mean, many of us met our spouses at the office. It's the part of their social life. They've left college. They've now been thrust into some new environment, and they have to get to know it. The whole mentoring that goes on in the hallways and in the elevators. That's something that we have to be very intentional about. It's not going to happen, just by chance and listening in on conversations. It's something that's possible with remote work, and certainly the companies that are fully remote have already conquered it. But it's something that we're going to have to be very intentional about. So the generational divides, I think, are interesting, but I think also the minority divides are interesting. It turns out that minorities have a higher desire to work from home. So if you match that with the fact that 70% of managers say that they would favor somebody on site for promotions and the best assignments and so forth, which has been predicted all along, then what we might actually have is a greater gap in, or actually lose some ground in diversity, because those at home won't get the same opportunities as those in the office. Again, it can work. It's just that we have to be very, very careful about thinking about those inequities. Ditto for introverts. I happen to be an introvert. It's just been fabulous the last 3 years of not having to make up an excuse for why I didn't want to, go out to a bar after work. And that, I'm one of probably about half of the population. And workplaces were built for extroverts, these big, noisy places where introverts don't thrive, where a lot of the neurodiverse don't thrive, where the disabled have trouble being. And so this opened up, I think, a whole new thought pool by giving people that work remotely a way to participate that isn't necessarily barging into a conversation, which introverts are not good at doing. And in some ways, women aren't as good at doing as men. You can put your hand up, your little gold hand in the corner, or you can type something into the chat, or you can use asynchronous documents where you can think about things before you respond, which is typical of introverts also. They like to think about things. They don't blurt. And so, whatever we do, I think that has been progress that we need to maintain, that I think it's important to maintain. And again, a lot of intentionality has to go around that.
Kate, I think you teed up Jeff really well, and I wanted to get this question in because Jeff, you mentioned about leadership, that we need new, I won't say a new form of leadership, but leadership skills have changed and managing that, which includes creating that culture. And you've talked a lot about the digital employee experience. And even though I was focused on candidate experience and employee experience, really didn't think about the digital employee experience, but that has a huge impact. So you've had some great research and studies, doing that. And just to dovetail on Kate's point, and I think this was from that same newsletter that I quoted before, one November or December, so everybody can go back and look at it, the one about commuting. It's that maybe less than half of employers have trained their employees and managers how to work remote. And so the blame becomes, oh, that darn Zoom. There's just no good way to have a conversation or a relationship. And yet there's other people that are doing it, which means it's possible. You just haven't learned how to do it. So, Jeff?
Yeah, digital experience is, you're right, Ira, and then we did recently commission a study on this, that it is becoming a premium lens with which potential new employees are measuring their options. And Gad may have seen some of this in his own research, meaning I want to know the tools that I can use at your company. I want to know that I can be on the network from just about everywhere, the notion of edge computing and edge work. And I want to know that my onboarding is smooth and easy, and then I get excellent support when I need it from an IT perspective. And so there's a whole, new kind of sub-industry within the enterprise software business called digital experience platform solutions, which are measuring a company's effectiveness in these various areas. The five of us, when we started our careers, I seriously doubt any one of us asked our potential employer about the digital experience, right? And hey, how good is the IT organization, and is it a pleasant experience, and so on. They are now. It is a criteria now, and they're asking, what's it like? And you have to have a score. You have to have some form of basis with which to say we're an excellent digital experience company, and we provide the right tools for an excellent remote work experience. So that is part of the adjustment, right? Organizations are having to make. In fact, CIOs and the entire C-suite want to brag now, if they're good, about, hey, if you're looking for an excellent digital experience and being able to very easily, with a lot of flexibility, do your work, come here, right? So it becomes a proof point on what, again, the next top 100 great companies to work for. It's a criteria now that the next generation workforce, and even, I'll go back to your earlier question about generational gaps. I actually saw, at least from my experience, and it's not entirely a fair comparison to the workforce at large, because IT has already been in tune with remote working for a long time, right? The generations actually kind of came together and bonded during the pandemic at Avanti, and I think it was kind of a kinship, and different methods were established for maintaining culture, like digital rooms for the chess club and digital rooms for the cooking club, and people stopping at 2:00 on Thursdays to do as many push-ups as you could do with your camera on, right? Things like that. So it's interesting that the generations came together to create new digital culture phenomenons to create a better experience from a remote perspective. But going back to your core point, Ira, yes, digital experience is now becoming a requirement for the remote workforce.
And Gad, it looked like you had some thoughts to share too in regard to some of the generational effects of learning how to do remote work well too.
Well, it's not so much generational, but as a kind of continuing on Kate's thoughts, and my point here may be a little controversial, so I apologize in advance, but it could be that kind of people will select themselves based on their characteristics into remote work companies versus in-office companies. So it could be that people who are extroverts and career-driven will select themselves into in the office companies, and introvert and work-life balance people will select themselves into remote companies. So we may have kind of over time two types of the companies that will differ not just in how remote they go, but because of that, they will also differ in the characteristics of the workers working for them.
I like that, Gad. You know, I tend to think too, many times I have conversations with folks outside of work, even just personal connections. And sometimes we talk about what's the preferred temperature inside your house? Because to me, I'm a 67-degree guy. You know, that's the sweet spot. That's where I like it. And then I have some people that are like, Jason, you're absolutely nuts. It needs to be 72 or 73. I've got others that are like, no, you need to be down around 62, 63. And so it almost is kind of like, you know, different flavors there, Gad. To your point, I think there is going to be a lot more selection that people have that maybe they didn't feel like they had in the past, even though there was opportunity to maybe work other places. Remote work has opened up that possibility to work for and with many other organizations than ever before to try and do that. One other fascinating question, we've got several that are coming in here, but one I want to get to here is from John Aiden Byrne, a good friend of ours, and Ira actually does a segment with him on his show. He brought up a question about, with remote work, are we starting to surge into this concept of smart cities, where things are more interconnected? And he said specifically where we're building out the infrastructure in cities for community living, social spaces, smart spaces, mini village ambiances, sports facilities, coffee shops, green spaces, a model of living that could make it easier to launch more companies remote and help support some of those cultures and initiatives. Any opinions or things that you've come across around this concept of, as we paint the future, what does this look like when we think about the future of work? What does it make the future of our cities look like?
I don't see any of those smart cities. I mean, I see some, but I think it's actually had the opposite effect because nobody knows what's going to happen with cities. Some of the cities that have had an influx of workers, a number of cities in Texas, for example, Austin, Atlanta, some of those cities, you know, maybe they are ripe for that kind of transformation, and we were already on that course before. It has to go that way. It just has to. I mean, you know, when I want the Uber driver to know that I have a noon appointment and it's going to take me a half an hour to get there because of the feed that he gets from traffic, and he'll be at the door and he'll have my lunch order, you know, with all of that connection. I think actually it's a lot further along than people are ready for. They found this in the GSK building in the Netherlands 10, 15 years ago. They were already doing what I was just talking about, you know, directing me to a place in the garage to put me near where I needed to be for my first meeting, prompting me that I needed to move now to go get to that meeting, putting me in a room that was conducive to concentration because it knew I was working on a presentation that morning, and having my caramel macchiato available to me from the coffee machine, because when I walked up to it, it knew who I was. People weren't quite ready for that, and I'm not sure they still are. There's this whole issue around privacy, and I think it's a very strong conversation. I did a post on it last week about what we need to learn from grocery stores and how much grocery stores know about us and how willingly we give away that information. And yet when our employer is going to try to gather that information, we go, ooh, I don't know. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we need to, that what the grocery store knows about us is freaking scary, even in an anonymized sense. Because they sell that anonymized information and it can be de-anonymized very easily. I won't go on any more about that, but back to smart cities, you know, the cities like San Francisco, I mean, they're dying. I mean, and it's a snowball thing, right? Because we don't have the transportation taxes that funded a lot of city activities. that funded public transportation. So now public transportation isn't running as often as it did. There's more crime in these downtown cities, and people don't want to come down there, but we don't have the money to fix it because we're not collecting it from the employers who have now moved out. So there's a big snowball effect here, unintended consequences that we really have to work through to see what's going to happen to cities in the long run.
Go ahead, Gad.
If I can add, I think the shift to remote work all of a sudden made a few millions of Americans free agents in terms of where they choose to live. Like before that, they were tied down to the metro area where their office was. Now they can live further away or anywhere. And those few millions in the next several years will decide where they want to settle down. And I think for mayors, especially kind of small, attractive places, I think there will be a competition of who gets those, not all the millions, but who will get some of those millions. And speaking of mayors, it's unrelated, but I was, last week or the week before, I was in Fairhaven, Vermont, and I found out that the mayor there is a goat.
As in like animal goat or greatest of all time?
No. The
Wow.
election is open to animals, and they
Oh.
voted for a goat. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Does he have an NFT that we can purchase? Hey, I can't believe what time it is here because, I mean, this is just amazing how quickly this is going. We want to continue this conversation as long as we can. And basically through comments. I mean, so this is live on multiple social media platforms. If you have questions, if you want to interact, if you agree or disagree, or if you have a question for, either Kate, Jeff, or Gad, or Jason or myself, please put them up there. So we'll continue that. Also, I want to give a shout out to Bill Keller, who put a comment in here, and we'll have to address that later about the 40-hour work week. Do you think this is going to change that 40-hour work week? It may be decades before the government catches up to what full-time and part-time looks like, but we'll have to deal with that. But Bill is going to be our newest GGG Unleashed partner, a new series, Beyond the Office. So appropriate topic, Beyond the Office, leading remote work teams. So he'll be talking about that. Bill's got an incredible background. I've known him for 20 years. But watch out for that. And then also, for those, I mentioned it earlier, check out Jeff's GGG Unleashed, the first episode, about talking about why we're not going back to normal. And I think today we pretty much convinced everybody there's a lot of work to do. We had to figure a lot of things out, but we're definitely not going back to normal. However, before we wrap up today, I want to kind of close out with our usual question that we let everybody have. And I think all of you have had this at one time. What, for each of you, what is something that we should have asked you, but we didn't? Let's see. Everybody looking up.
Well, I can start. So one big change is in the employer's willingness to hire to hire outside of their metro areas. And I think that's a big change. We did some research and found that if you look at tech companies in the West Coast, before the pandemic, about 70% of their hires were in the West Coast, and now it's less than 50%. So there was definitely a shift away from the metro areas where they used to hire. And that means that now those very successful tech companies are competing with other employers in many other markets. So that's another big change of the result of the shift to remote work.
I think for me, guys, the question that I would have liked to have been asked that we need to actually explore as experts even further is, are we truly, yes or no, more productive? Right? And by what measure are we going to answer that question? Right? The whole idea that there are ways to observe your workforce now from a remote perspective and monitor, are they actually on the network and on the systems and doing their jobs, is an open question. And I don't have an answer, but I think that is the next area of evaluation as we evolve into a more permanent remote workforce is, are we getting the expected productivity?
Well, we're going to have you back, and hopefully we can have all of you back to talk about that, because I have a feeling that's going to be an ongoing conversation for quite a while, because we weren't very good at measuring productivity before the pandemic.
Yeah, I guess for me it would be where does sustainability fit in all of this? We expected to see a decline in vehicle miles traveled that didn't happen. That in fact it went up above the 2019 by 2022. I mean, huge down in 2020 and 2021, but back up and even in excess. Congestion was reduced, and therefore the greenhouse gases were reduced. But again, I think we have to go back and change our thinking about how we travel when we're not commuting. What has happened and what was predicted before the pandemic was that because we're not going to and from the office and doing our errands along the way, trip chaining, we're going out and doing this, and we're going out and doing that, and going out and doing that. And each one of those starts of your car is more difficult or more polluting. So, just being conscious of that element of sustainability. And then certainly in terms of, we don't need any more commercial office buildings. That they're a huge portion of global warming. So how do we leverage this remote work in a way that allows us to actually reduce the greenhouse gas output of buildings? Because right now they're sitting open and nobody's using them.
What's really interesting, Kate, and I'm glad you brought that up. I actually was going to introduce that. I don't have it right in front of me, but maybe about a week or two ago, there was a big article about suburban corporate spaces in Philadelphia, about the amount of that. It's not just the center city, that metropolitan office corporate space that's open, but a lot of these suburban corporate centers were built 20, 30, well, actually 30, 40, 50 years ago, as the baby boomers started to come in the market. And now their buildings they're just way too expensive to retrofit. And the amount of suburban corporate space is also, so it's not just in the cities, but a lot of the suburban space, as well. And they're going to be very difficult to repurpose easily. But it's also interesting that you brought up about sustainability, because there's so many initiatives for ESG, and I'd be curious what the ESG strategies are for the companies that are requiring people to come back to the workplace. Is it just one more poster mission on, mission statement, but not acting it out? So again, ongoing subject. We've had a whole slew of additional comments and questions. We've got to thank everybody for submitting those, but thanks for the panel. I mean, we generated a lot of interest. This is going to continue. For any questions we didn't get answered, hopefully Kate, Gad, and Jeff, you can kind of dive in and maybe respond to some of the people. But we'd love to have you back. We're gonna continue to do these about every 6 to 8 weeks. Have special events, and we'd love to have you back. So let's go around again the stage here. Kate, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you, to get that newsletter, or to read more things about you?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Globalworkplaceanalytics.com. You'll find a lot of information there. I belong to a group called Workplace Evolutionaries that's very focused on all of this. I suggest you maybe look that up or ping me, and I'd be happy to share information. But thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's always fun to talk to you guys.
Well, thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I think the best way to find me or to see what Avanti's all about, and this is what we do. We help create the everywhere workplace, is Avanti.com. And actually, there's a few thought leadership pieces out there on these topics we've been discussing that they're free to download. So I encourage the listeners and the viewers to do that. And thank you, Ira and Jason. It's been a pleasure.
And don't forget to check out your GGG Unleashed, which
That's
you can
right.
find on the Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization feed. So it's very, very easy. You don't even have to get another address. Just if you're listening to this, it's there. Just look it up. I think it came out last week. So. Gad?
Well, I'm very active in LinkedIn, so I post thoughts and things related to the things that we write at the Burning Glass Institute. So just find me on LinkedIn. That's the best way to follow me.
Well, thank you to everyone for being here. You've got incredibly busy schedules, but so pleased that you took the opportunity to come out and engage in this conversation. And you brought up things that I know I hadn't thought of, and I spend a lot of time trying to figure this out. I'm sure I can speak for Jason the same way. But from the number of comments and some of the questions, I think our listeners will agree. And if you want to catch the replays, you can do that on any of the social media, but it'll also be available on the podcast that you'll be able to listen to. So again, thank you guys very much. We'll certainly be in touch. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Ira, just when you think you can't peel off any more layers around remote work, I think we peeled off and discovered several more today with Kate, Jeff, and Gad. Any major takeaways for you today that were kind of like aha moments?
Yeah, I think it was a confirmation. This is really crazy. Complicated. It's not complicated. It's complex. There's so many moving pieces. I mean, just as Kate brought up right at the end about sustainability, how that's going to affect it, about generations, how that's going to affect it. But we also, the digital experience, we didn't even dive into that a lot with Jeff. I mean, we touched on it, but just, considering that you're bringing people back to the workplace with smartphones and smartwatches, some of these things weren't that readily available just a few years ago. Now everybody walks in with that, which means they're hopping on your network, and just the opportunity to introduce what they really do is traditional, intrusions into their security and their privacy. So that's a whole other event, but you're going to be hearing a lot about that on Jeff's, on the GGG Unleashed series for Protect and Connect. So.
That's right. And for me, I tend to think now a lot of times in terms of viewing the world through the eyes of my kids. I've got 4 boys, as you well know, that are under the age of 9. And I think as we were talking today about what do the future of cities look like, are cities going to look totally different and function totally differently from how all of us on the panel today grew up in terms of thinking about cities? I think that's absolutely, I know it's terrifying for some, but I think it's fascinating to think that we may better engineer and design and use space in ways that brings more value to communities. And even though, as Kate said, I think it's going to be rough in the short term trying to figure things out, I'm very hopeful in the future that this will lead to some wonderful change for communities and cities. But until next time, we want to thank our listeners, Googleization Nation, for tuning in today. If you haven't, smash the subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform. We'd love for you to do that. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Until next time, I'm Jason Cochran signing off.
And I'm Ira Wolfe. Special thanks to the Y Institute for helping us sponsor this episode. Thank you for being part of Googleization Nation. And until next time, don't let the shift hit your plans.